Think about the last time you sat down for a good meal. Imagine the simple, almost thoughtless act of taking a pepper grinder and twisting it over a warm plate of food. Hear that soft, grinding crunch. Smell the sharp, earthy dust as it settles. You probably don't think twice about it. Whoever loves to cook surely has a cabinet lined with cloves, saffron, nutmeg, and a dozen other things we sprinkle into our lives every single day. Now look away from your kitchen. Look around the room you are in right now. You are likely surrounded by the symbols of multinational corporations. You see the logo of Apple on your desk or Coca-Cola on a billboard outside. You hear about the stock market on the morning news. You know about shares, dividends, market caps. You probably follow the modern conversations we have today, the intense debates about post-colonialism, corporate overreach, the ethics of global supply chains. We tend to think of all these things: the spices in our pantries, the stock market, the multinational megacorporation, the dark legacies of colonialism, as separate threads of the human experience. But what if I told you that they are all intimately and violently connected? To understand the modern world, we have to look back to a specific moment in time. We have to look at an entity that was not merely a business, but a sovereign Leviathan. It is perhaps the very first time in the entire history of our species that a commercial organization became larger, wealthier, and far more terrifyingly powerful than the very state that gave it its name. We are talking about the Dutch East India Company. The VOC modern economists, when trying to wrap their heads around the sheer scale of this entity, have attempted to adjust its peak value into modern currency. The number they land on is roughly 7.4 trillion US dollars. It is a sum of wealth so vast, so unfathomable, that it defies human comprehension. And it happened in the 1600s. How does something like that even come into existence? How does a wet, boggy stretch of land in northern Europe produce an empire that buys and sells the earth? We are going to take a journey to find out. And it is a long, dark journey. We will start in the claustrophobic, plague-haunted streets of medieval Europe, where a handful of dust was worth more than a human life. We will sail to the sweltering, blood-soaked beaches of the Banda Islands, where paradise was turned into a factory. We will walk the artificial fan-shaped island of Dejima in Japan, a golden cage built for greedy men. We will stand on the splintering decks of galleons in the English Channel as empires tear each other apart for market supremacy. And perhaps most chillingly, we will look deep into the meticulously kept ledgers of men who calmly weighed the price of nutmeg against the cost of human souls. But before we can understand the men who built this trillion-dollar empire, we have to understand the obsession that drove them into the unknown. We have to take a step back. We have to talk about the mirage of the East. You see, for the people of the ancient and medieval world, spices were not just a way to make a piece of boiled meat taste better. They were a supreme, mystical commodity. They were highly prized in the Roman Empire, fiercely guarded in Byzantium. But as we move into the Middle Ages, they become something almost mythical in Europe. Why? Because they were so incredibly difficult to get. To a medieval European, a spice was a synonym for absolute, untouchable luxury. It was the equivalent of a modern billionaire's hyper-dot car or a flawless diamond. They were considered potent medicines, vital for balancing the humors of the body. They were status symbols, to give you a sense of the sheer gravity of their value. In medieval France, for a single pound of nutmeg, you could trade 3 entire sheep. It was a staggering, almost absurd amount of wealth concentrated into a shriveled little nut or a dried piece of bark. And the reason for this astronomical cost was the geography of the earth. These exotic treasures, nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, they didn't grow in the cold, muddy fields of Europe. They grew in what was then called the Spice Islands, the Maluku Islands, deep in the lush, humid embrace of Southeast Asia, near modern-day Java. For a clove to reach the table of a French duke, it had to survive a grueling multi-continental odyssey. It was harvested by local Javanese farmers. It was shipped to the great bustling metropolis of Malacca, in modern-day Indonesia. There, it was purchased by Arab merchants. The Sultan of Malacca, naturally, took his heavy cut. Then those Arab merchants dragged these precious cargoes across the perilous waters of the Indian Ocean, through the scorching deserts of Africa, up to the Nile. From the Nile, it moved into the Mediterranean Sea, where it was finally bought by Venetian or Genoese traders, who then sold it into the heart of Europe. One medieval chronicler noted, with a mix of awe and frustration, that a single sack of spices changed hands 12 times before it ever reached a European dining hall. 12 different merchants taking their cut. The margins were astronomical. Traders were seeing returns of 2,000 to 2,500%. It was the Bitcoin of the Middle Ages, a super profitable asset that made men kings. During the French Revolution, years later, the people trusted to run the Bureau of Weights and Measures were the spice merchants, because they were the only men fastidious enough to understand that a single gram of missing saffron was like losing a gram of solid gold. At the very center of this river of wealth sat the city of Malacca. It was the grand choke point of the world. It sat exactly at the crossroads of the trade routes between the ancient powerhouses of China and India. Every merchant ship, whether Arab or Chinese, that navigated those waters was forced to stop there. They had to refill their fresh water, restock their provisions, and, most importantly, wait on the monsoon winds. The fragile wooden ships of that era simply could not fight a heavy ocean storm. They had to wait for the winds to turn. Malacca was a glittering cosmopolitan waiting room for the wealthiest men on earth, and it was this immense strategic value that drew the wolves. In the year 1511, a new breed of sailor arrives in the waters of Southeast Asia, the Portuguese. These were magnificent navigators, men who had charted the unknown edges of the map. They took one look at Malacca, quickly did the math on the wealth flowing through its ports, and decided they were not going to pay the Sultan's taxes anymore. By force of arms, the Portuguese fleet shatters the local defenses. Malacca is captured. It instantly becomes a Portuguese colony, a fortified fortress at the edge of the world. The Portuguese don't stop there. They look to the Sultanate of Bantam on Java. They look to China. They look to India. And all along the coasts and islands, they begin hammering stone into fortresses. They build a wall of military and commercial outposts. They monopolize the spice trade, locking down the ocean. And for the next 80.4 years, Portugal reaps an unimaginable, inhuman fortune. But while Portugal rules the East, the landscape of Europe is shifting violently. Spain is the great, terrifying superpower of the era. The Spanish are not terribly interested in the slow, meticulous trade of spices. They are addicted to the immediate, heavy thrill of gold and silver, which they are ripping out of the Americas by the galleon load. The Spanish Empire is immensely wealthy, heavily armed, and constantly at war, particularly with England. And Spain is hungry. In 1550.6, the Spanish Empire absorbs 17 provinces to its north, the region we now know as the Netherlands. And then, in 1580.1, the Spanish crown does the unthinkable. It swallows Portugal. Through what some historians call a union, and Portuguese historians rightly call an aggressive takeover, the two Iberian nations are fused under a single Spanish monarch. Suddenly, Spain controls the gold of the West and the spices of the East. But the Spanish overreach. Their bitter, bleeding rivalry with England leads them to assemble the Invincible Armada, a colossal fleet meant to crush the English once and for all. But the English Channel is a cruel mistress. Between savage storms and relentless English naval tactics, the mighty armada is turned into splintered driftwood. With the Spanish military severely bruised and their monarch Philip II dead, the subjugated territories smell blood in the water. A massive rebellion ignites in the Netherlands. It's a long, brutal conflict, but it ends with the nation fracturing. The southern half, heavily garrisoned and Catholic, remains with Spain. But the northern half, fiercely Protestant and fiercely independent, breaks away. This seems like a victory. But for the newly independent Dutch, it is an economic death sentence. The Netherlands was a nation that lived and died by the sea. They were traders, shipbuilders, merchants, and the vengeful Spanish, reeling from the loss of their northern provinces, simply slam the door shut. They blockade the ports. Dutch ships are seized or sent to the bottom of the sea. And most devastatingly, the spice markets of Lisbon, the only place in Europe to buy the wealth of the East, are strictly forbidden to Dutch merchants. The Dutch could still buy spices, of course, but only through third or fourth parties, at crippling markups that left no room for profit. The lifeblood of their economy was cut. This is the great structural contradiction of history. Out of the desperate, suffocating blockade of a small, freezing republic, the greatest engine of capitalist expansion was about to be born. The Dutch realized that if they could not buy the spices in Europe, they would simply have to sail to the source. They would have to find the Spice Islands themselves. But there was a massive problem. The routes to the east, the detailed nautical charts showing the treacherous shoals, the shifting winds, and the hidden currents were the most fiercely guarded state secrets on the planet. The Portuguese guarded those maps like holy relics. You could not buy them. You could not hire a Portuguese skipper or a Portuguese deckhand. The entire Portuguese elite was getting fat on this monopoly, and they would kill anyone who tried to break it. The Dutch were blind, staring out into an endless, terrifying ocean. To survive, they didn't need merchants, they needed spies. But the Dutch were nothing if not pragmatic. If they couldn't buy the maps from the Portuguese, they would steal them. And so begins one of the most consequential and desperate espionage operations of the early modern period. The Dutch sent men into the very heart of the enemy. Dutch agents infiltrated Lisbon, living there for years. They drank in the taverns. They listened to the loose lips of Portuguese sailors, slowly piecing together the fragmented rumors of the southern seas. They bribed, they cajoled, they observed. They were hunting for a ghost, the fabled route to the Spice Islands. Finally, a man named Cornelis de Houtman hits the jackpot. In Lisbon, he doesn't just hear rumors. He manages to acquire actual, highly classified Portuguese nautical charts. There is a persistent historical legend that disgruntled Jesuit priests, angry with the Portuguese crown, sold these maps to the Dutch. We cannot definitively verify that, but the fact remains. Houtman gets the charts. He smuggles this priceless intelligence back to the mud and brick of Amsterdam. The Dutch immediately weaponize this knowledge. In 1596, they outfit a small fleet and hurl it into the unforgiving void of the ocean. You have to understand the sheer, paralyzing terror of this voyage. These were wooden tubs, entirely at the mercy of monstrous rogue waves, crippling outbreaks of scurvy, and navigational errors that could leave a crew starving in the doldrums for months. But they pushed through. Using the stolen Portuguese routes, they crossed the vast expanses, rounded the brutal tip of Africa, and miraculously arrived on the shores of Java, at the Sultanate of Bantam. What they saw there was, to a European eye, a commercial Garden of Eden. Spices, nutmeg, cloves, pepper were piled up like ordinary grain. It was El Dorado, not of gold, but of bark and seed. They immediately set up a small trading post, crammed their holds full of these exotic treasures, and began the agonizing journey back to Europe. But progress demands a terrible toll. The mathematics of this early spice trade were written in human blood. To give you a stark picture, for every 3 ships that sailed out of Amsterdam seeking the east, only 1 returned. The other 2 were swallowed by typhoons, gutted by mutinies, captured by pirates, or destroyed by local populations defending their shores. Even Houtman, the man who stole the fire of the gods and brought the maps to Holland, didn't survive the era. He continued sailing as a captain and was eventually killed, and according to local accounts, eaten by natives on a distant island. Yet look at the brutal economics. That single ship out of 3 that limped back into Amsterdam harbor, its sails torn and its crew decimated, carried enough cargo to entirely pay for the 2 lost ships, compensate the dead, buy 2 brand new vessels, and still shower its investors in unimaginable wealth. The profits were simply too colossal to ignore. The Dutch merchants threw themselves into the meat grinder. Instantly, the oceans became a hyper-violent arena. The Portuguese were entirely unamused by these northern upstarts encroaching on their divine monopoly. And you have to remember, competition in the late 16th century wasn't about lowering prices or running clever advertising. Business competition meant finding your rival's ship at anchor in the dead of night, setting it on fire, and hanging the surviving crew from the yardarm. That was the reality of the free market. It was a kill or be killed scramble for the wealth of the world. But behind this chaotic, bloody free-for-all lay a deeper truth. The Dutch, practical to a fault, realized that fighting the sea, fighting the Portuguese, and fighting each other was bleeding them dry. If they were going to truly conquer the East, they had to evolve. While the spice fleets were battering each other in the Indonesian archipelago, another narrative was quietly unfolding further north. In the year 1600, a different Dutch trading company dispatched 5 ships to find a route to Japan. Among the crew was a man named William Adams, an English navigator. The Dutch often hired Englishmen or Italians, anyone who knew the secrets of navigating the deep ocean. When this battered, exhausted fleet finally washed up on the shores of Japan, the men were utterly captivated. They saw a highly sophisticated society producing exquisite porcelain, intricate metalwork, and sitting on vast reserves of silver. But the Portuguese were already there. They had established trading posts and brought Jesuit missionaries. The moment the Dutch arrived, the Portuguese whispered poison into the ears of the local warlords, claiming these Protestant newcomers were nothing but violent pirates. Adams and his crew were promptly thrown into a dungeon in Osaka. They were eventually brought before the man who would soon become the supreme military dictator of Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu was a shrewd, calculating leader. He interrogated Adams, and instead of executing him, he saw the immense value in this foreign navigator's knowledge of shipbuilding and mathematics. Adams never returned to England. He remained in Japan, became a trusted advisor to the shogun, and was elevated to the rank of samurai, the first European to ever hold the title. He grew immensely wealthy, managing trade through his old Dutch connections, and to this day there is a neighborhood in Tokyo bearing his Japanese name. The letters Adams managed to smuggle back to Europe were a revelation. Japan was a gold mine of silk, silver, and tea. The Dutch merchants looked at the map, they looked at the staggering death tolls of their disorganized fleets, and they had a terrifying epiphany. 4 or 5 separate Dutch companies fighting each other, while simultaneously fending off Portuguese galleons, Arab corsairs, and Chinese pirates, was absolute madness. Enter a Dutch statesman named Johan van Oldenbarnevelt. He stood before the chaotic, greedy merchants of the Netherlands and proposed a radical idea. Stop fighting. Pool the capital. Merge every single trading house into one colossal, unified monopoly. And so, in 1602, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie was born. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC. They even created history's first recognized corporate logo, a simple, striking monogram that would soon become more feared than the flag of any nation. But you have to understand, this was not merely a company. Under the direction of the Heeren 17, the Lord 17, a board of the wealthiest patricians in the Republic, the VOC was granted terrifying powers by the Dutch government. They were not just authorized to trade, they were granted the sovereign right to build massive war fleets, to negotiate international treaties in the name of the Netherlands, to mint their own currency, and most crucially, to raise their own private armies. They were a nation-state disguised as a merchant guild. To fund this Leviathan, the Dutch invented a financial mechanism that completely altered the trajectory of human history. In that same year, 1602, they established the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. They broke the ownership of the company down into shares. One share cost around 3,000 guilders, an immense sum. But the beauty of the share was its fluidity. It wasn't just a piece of paper in a vault. It could be bought, sold, traded, used as collateral for loans, or passed down to your children. Anyone with the capital could invest. A baker, a blacksmith, a minor noble. They could all pool their money to build a galleon. The returns were staggering. Within 2 years, the stock value skyrocketed by 110%. By 1610, it had surged to 130%. Initially, dividends weren't even paid in cash. If you held stock, the company would simply back up a cart to your house and unload sacks of black pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. By 1644, they shifted entirely to paying out cold, hard cash. Armed with this endless fountain of public investment, the VOC unleashed a tidal wave of violence and commerce upon the globe. In 1603, an admiral named Jacob van Heemskerk captured a massive Portuguese merchant ship, the Santa Catarina, off the coast of Singapore. It was packed to the rafters with flawless Chinese porcelain. When he dragged it back to Amsterdam, it sold for 3.5 million guilders. Van Heemskerk personally pocketed 1 million. The message was clear. They needed to break into the Chinese market. That same year, another admiral, Stephen von der Hagen, pushed all the way to Calcutta in India, establishing outposts among rivers of diamonds, emeralds, and ivory. He even sailed as far south as the coast of Australia, becoming one of the first Europeans to document its shoreline. On his way back, he stopped at the island of Mauritius, where his hungry crew encountered a strange, flightless bird. He noted in his logs that the meat was incredibly tough, foul-smelling, and completely disgusting. That bird was the dodo, and the VOC's hungry sailors would soon eat the species into total extinction. By 1607, the Dutch were systematically dismantling the old world order. A VOC fleet sailed right up to the Iberian Peninsula and annihilated a Spanish armada in the Bay of Gibraltar, proving that the oceans no longer belonged to Madrid. They were pushing into every corner of the earth. In 1609, they hired the English explorer Henry Hudson to find a northern passage to Asia. Instead, he sailed up a river in North America, leading to the foundation of New Amsterdam, a little trading post we now call New York. That same year, a navigator named Hendrik Brouwer discovered the Roaring Forties, a fast, dangerous wind route stretching from the Cape of Good Hope straight to the Sunda Strait, cutting travel time to the east by months. The VOC had mapped the world. They had the ships, they had the unlimited funding of the stock market, and they had a foothold on 4 continents. But behind this golden age of discovery lay a dark, festering reality. To truly control the spice trade, finding the islands wasn't enough. Building trading posts wasn't enough. They had to own the land, and they had to break the people who lived on it. And to do that, they would need to appoint a man who viewed human life merely as a negative number on a balance sheet. But to simply arrive in the East was no longer enough. By 1610, the men sitting in the pristine, oak-paneled boardrooms of Amsterdam realized that the chaotic free for all of the early spice rush was terribly inefficient. They didn't just want to participate in the market, they wanted to become the market. To achieve this, the Dutch East India Company created the office of the Governor-General, backed by a Council of the Indies. Essentially, they birthed a massive sovereign shadow state on the other side of the planet, thousands of miles away from any moral or legal oversight. And the man who would truly build this empire, the dark architect of the VOC's golden age, was a brilliant, utterly ruthless accountant named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. You see, Cohen had studied commercial bookkeeping in Italy. He understood the world not as a tapestry of cultures and peoples, but as a vast, interconnected ledger of credits and debits. In his early travels to the Indonesian archipelago, he looked at the tangled web of Portuguese forts, English interlopers, and defiant local sultans, and he saw only a catastrophic loss of profit. He returned to Amsterdam and drafted a chillingly lucid memorandum to the Lord 17. His thesis was devastating in its simplicity. The company could not trade without war, and it could not wage war without trade. If they wanted a true monopoly, they had to physically eradicate the competition. Every Portuguese merchant, every English captain, and every local inhabitant who refused to submit must be eliminated. The islands must be conquered, fully and totally, using overwhelming dictatorial violence. The wealthy lords of Amsterdam read this terrifying document, looked at the projected profit margins, and essentially said, "Excellent. Proceed." By 1613, Cohen was back in the Indies, rapidly climbing the corporate ladder. He proved astonishingly effective. He monopolized the clove and nutmeg trade in his sector. When a local sultan tried to quietly sell pepper to other buyers, Cohen didn't negotiate. He simply ordered the city of Jakarta to be put to the torch. Out of the smoldering ashes of that settlement, he laid the foundation stones of a new, heavily fortified corporate capital. He named it Batavia. For centuries, this city, which we now know as Jakarta, would serve as the unassailable nerve center of the Dutch colonial machine. Here, the company minted its own coins, drafted its own laws, and planned its conquests. But even Cohen knew that Dutch soldiers were expensive and prone to dying of tropical diseases. To project true terror, he needed a different kind of weapon. He needed men who knew only war. Through his early contacts with Japan, Cohen had learned of the Ronin, masterless samurai, elite warriors cast adrift in a changing Japanese society. These men were highly disciplined, utterly fearless, and looking for employment. Cohen immediately recognized their value. The VOC began importing these heavily armed Japanese mercenaries into the sweltering jungles of Indonesia. This was, in essence, the modern world's first private military contractor. These mercenaries were bound by incredibly strict corporate contracts: no alcohol on the voyage, no brawling with the Dutch officers, absolute unquestioning obedience. Armed with their traditional blades and early firearms, these Ronin became the shock troops of the VOC, cutting a bloody swath through the remnants of the Portuguese forces and terrified local militias. And it was with this heavily militarized corporate army that Cohen committed the act that would define his legacy and expose the true horrifying cost of the spice trade. It was 1620.1. The Banda Islands were the only place on Earth where the nutmeg tree grew. The local islanders, understandably tired of the crushing Dutch monopoly, had begun secretly trading with English merchants who offered better prices. For Cohen, this was not a political rebellion. It was a breach of contract, and the penalty was absolute erasure. Cohen sailed to the Banda Islands with a massive fleet and his Japanese mercenaries. What followed was not a battle, but an industrial-scale extermination. In a matter of weeks, the VOC slaughtered nearly 15,000 men, women, and children. The population of the islands was virtually wiped out. When the news of this massacre eventually filtered back to the polite drawing rooms of Europe, even the hardened Dutch merchants were horrified. They demanded Cohen explain his madness, but Cohen's defense was pure, chilling corporate logic. He pointed out that the local population had been nothing but trouble. They demanded fair prices. They revolted. They refused to work for starvation wages. By removing them entirely, he argued, the company now owned the land outright. And who would harvest the nutmeg? Cohen had a solution for that too. The company would simply sail to their newly established outposts in Africa, purchase enslaved people who had no ties to the land, no means of rebellion, and no human rights, and ship them to the empty islands. This was the horrific birth of the VOC's internal slave trade, the total depopulation of an island, replaced by a captive workforce, all to ensure that a pound of nutmeg yielded maximum returns in Amsterdam. But the violence didn't stop with the indigenous populations. The paranoia of monopoly breeds a very specific kind of madness. In 1620.3, this paranoia exploded in what became known as the Amboina Massacre. On the island of Ambon, the Dutch and the English had actually signed a peace treaty, agreeing to share the trade. But the local Dutch governor became convinced, on incredibly flimsy evidence, that the small garrison of English merchants, alongside a handful of Japanese mercenaries, were plotting to seize the fortress. The Dutch authorities arrested the English and the Japanese. They subjected them to agonizing, unspeakable tortures to extract confessions. Once the fabricated confessions were signed, the prisoners were led out to the courtyard. Some were hanged. Others were beheaded, their bodies quartered, the remains tossed carelessly into the dirt. When the details of Amboina reached London, the diplomatic shockwave was apocalyptic. You can slaughter 15,000 islanders in the dark corners of the globe, the European powers reasoned, but you do not torture and execute the subjects of the English crown. The English were furious. They demanded war. They demanded blood. The VOC scrambled to contain the fallout. They recalled Cohen to Amsterdam, claiming he had no direct knowledge of the event. They paid heavy financial reparations to the families of the dead English merchants. They threw money at the problem until the political fires were temporarily smothered. But the English never forgot. Decades later, men like Oliver Cromwell would still be using the blood spilled at Amboina as a rallying cry to launch devastating naval wars against the Dutch Republic. But behind this lay another truth. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen had secured the Spice Islands through terror, and the ledgers in Amsterdam were overflowing with gold. Yet the VOC's tentacles were already reaching for prizes far stranger, far wealthier, and far more isolated than the jungles of Java. By the 1630s, the Dutch East India Company was not just expanding, it was mutating into a truly global organism. They had captured Malacca. They had seized the island of Ceylon from the Portuguese, instantly imposing a cinnamon tax where every adult male on the island was forced to harvest and deliver 20.8 kilograms of cinnamon a year to the Dutch, entirely for free. A quota that would later climb to a back-breaking 300 kilograms. But of all the territories the VOC touched, none was more mysterious or more profitable than Japan. The Japanese had watched the arrival of the Europeans with growing deep suspicion. The shogunate had seen how the Portuguese operated. First came the merchants, then came the Jesuit priests, and soon after, the local lords were converting to Catholicism, shifting their loyalty from the shogun to the Pope in Rome. The Jesuits were masters of cultural adaptation, convincing the Japanese that their local Buddhist deities were simply different manifestations of the Christian God. It was highly effective, and to the central government, highly dangerous. The tension snapped in 1630.7 with the Shimabara Rebellion, a massive uprising of Japanese Christians heavily influenced by the Portuguese. The shogun's forces struggled to breach the thick walls of the rebel fortresses. In a stroke of ruthless opportunism, the Dutch offered their assistance. They brought their warships to the coast and used their heavy naval cannons to bombard the Christian rebels into submission. The shogun was thrilled. The Portuguese were permanently expelled from Japan. Christianity was brutally outlawed, and the Tokugawa shogunate slammed the doors of the country shut to the outside world, with one exception. As a reward for their cold-blooded artillery support, the Dutch were granted exclusive trading rights. But the Japanese were no fools. They had seen the contagion of European influence. They decreed that no foreigner could ever let their foot touch the sacred soil of the Japanese mainland. So, in the Bay of Nagasaki, they built an artificial island. They called it Dejima. Legend has it that when asked how the island should be shaped, the shogun simply threw his folding fan onto a table. And so, Dejima was built in the shape of a fan. It was a golden cage. The Dutch merchants who lived there were completely isolated. They could not cross the bridge to the mainland. No Japanese citizens were allowed on the island, except for government officials and heavily monitored courtesans. The rules were suffocating. The trading volume was strictly capped, sometimes just 20.2 ships a year, later reduced to 8. But the Dutch endured the humiliation. Why? Because the profits were astronomical. The VOC was pulling silk, incredibly fine porcelain, and vast amounts of silver out of Japan. In return, they introduced the isolated nation to the wonders of the Western world. The Dutch brought the first telescopes to Japan. They brought chocolate. They even brought the first billiard table. Because they were the only conduit between Japan and the rest of the planet, the VOC could dictate the terms. Historians calculate that the profit margin on the Japanese trade was occasionally as high as 40.5,000%. On a single contract of Tonkinese silk sold through Dejima, the company could net 700,000 guilders. While the VOC was draining the wealth of the East, its sibling organization, the Dutch West India Company, or the WIC, was founded in 1620.1 to conquer the Atlantic. The WIC operated on the same corporate principles, but its theater of war was the Americas and the coast of Africa. In 1620.8, a Dutch admiral named Piet Hein achieved the impossible. He ambushed the legendary Spanish silver fleet off the coast of Cuba. He captured so much silver that the sudden influx of wealth practically funded the entire Dutch government for a year. The WIC also founded a tiny, muddy settlement on the edge of North America called New Amsterdam. In 1620.9, they famously purchased the island of Manhattan from the local indigenous tribes for 60 guilders worth of trade goods. We often hear this story framed as a comical real estate swindle, but to the Dutch, Manhattan wasn't meant to be a glittering metropolis. It was just a cog in a massive corporate machine. It lacked gold or spices. Its only purpose was to use slave labor to grow grain to feed the company's other, more profitable colonies in Brazil and the Caribbean. And this brings us to the darkest, most enduring stain on the legacy of these massive Dutch corporations: the industrialization of human suffering. In 1650.2, the VOC established a tiny resupply station at the bottom of the world, the Cape of Good Hope, under the command of Jan van Riebeck. The idea was simple: a place for ships to repair sails and take on fresh water and vegetables before the agonizing push across the Indian Ocean. But the local populations understandably refused to become servants on their own land, so the Dutch began importing human beings. They dragged slaves from Angola, from Madagascar, from India, and forced them into the newly planted vineyards and cattle farms of the Cape Colony. This small supply post metastasized into the foundation of modern South Africa, built entirely on the broken backs of an enslaved workforce. Across the globe, from the sugar plantations of the Americas to the nutmeg groves of the Banda Islands to the vineyards of Cape Town, The Dutch corporate machine trafficked an estimated 600,000 to 1 million human beings. Families were shattered, cultures erased, and generations condemned to darkness, all to ensure that the dividends paid out in Amsterdam never faltered. We often speak of the 17th and 18th centuries as the dawn of the European Enlightenment, the era of reason, of science, of high philosophy. But there is a profound, sickening hypocrisy here. While gentlemen in Amsterdam and London were writing elegant treatises on the inherent rights of man and the liberty of the soul, their corporate fleets were methodically enslaving and exterminating millions of people just beyond the horizon. The gleaming civilized prosperity of Europe was quite literally built upon the blood and bone of the colonized world. Yet the VOC's influence was not solely built on terror. Their wealth and maritime supremacy made them an irresistible diplomatic force, even penetrating the frozen heart of the Russian Empire. In the late 17th century, Dutch cartographers like Nicolaas Witsen traveled through Muscovy, mapping the vast, unknown expanses of Tartary and Siberia. When a young, ambitious Tsar named Peter the Great wanted to drag his medieval nation into the modern era, he didn't look to London or Paris. He looked to Amsterdam. Peter traveled to the Netherlands, worked in the VOC shipyards, studied their maps, and absorbed their worldview. The Dutch East India Company essentially taught the Russian Empire how to sail, laying the foundational timbers of the Russian Navy. By the end of the 17th century, the VOC was an empire upon which the sun truly never set. They had 50,000 employees, a staggering number for the era. They commanded a fleet of 150 massive merchantmen and 40 dedicated warships. They held a monopoly on global trade that seemed unshakable. But a corporation is not a country. A monopoly breeds a very specific kind of rot, and the weight of its own suffocating greed was already beginning to fracture the hull. But how does a titan fall? How does a corporation with 50,000 employees, an invincible armada, and a monopoly on the most valuable commodities on Earth simply rot away? To understand the collapse of the Dutch East India Company, you have to understand the tyranny of distance. Imagine the reality of corporate management in the 17th century. Today, a CEO can send an email to a branch office in Jakarta and receive a reply in seconds. For the Lords 17 sitting in Amsterdam, sending an instruction to the Governor-General in Batavia took at least 6 months. And that was if the ship didn't sink in a typhoon off the coast of Madagascar. A simple question and answer required a year of waiting. You cannot run a centralized monopoly when your communication moves at the speed of wind and canvas. Because of this immense, agonizing distance, the regional managers of the VOC essentially became unchecked feudal lords. A man appointed to run a trading post in the Indies was virtually a king. He had his own soldiers, his own treasury, and his own local alliances, and very quickly, human nature took its course. The first deadly disease to strike the VOC was not scurvy or malaria. It was systemic, catastrophic corruption. The company struggled to pay adequate wages to its thousands of mid-level managers and sailors stationed in the sweltering, disease-ridden outposts of the East. So, an unspoken arrangement developed. The company looked the other way, while its employees engaged in private trading. A manager in Batavia might pool his money with a few other officers, buy a small ship, and trade porcelain or silk under the protective flag of the VOC, pocketing all the cash for themselves. Slowly but surely, the personal interests of the men on the ground began to cannibalize the interests of the shareholders back in Amsterdam. Enormous fortunes were made off the books. Local governors built lavish, sprawling estates on Java, entirely funded by black market cash. The corporation had morphed into a hollow shell, a massive, heavily armed state, within a state where everyone was violently skimming off the top. But internal rot alone rarely brings down an empire. For the final blow, you need an external predator. And that predator was waiting across the English Channel. The British had never forgotten the humiliation of the Amboina massacre, and they had spent a century quietly sharpening their knives. The English East India Company couldn't match the brute, overwhelming firepower of the Dutch in the Spice Archipelago, so they evolved. Where the Dutch used cannons, the British used diplomacy, bribery, and smuggling. The Dutch relied on a terrifying, absolute monopoly. If a local sultan tried to sell cinnamon to anyone else, the VOC would burn his capital. But the British merchants would slip into these blockaded ports under the cover of darkness. They would sit down with the aggrieved local rulers and whisper a very simple proposition. The Dutch are paying you 5 guilders for a pound of cinnamon and threatening to kill your family. We will pay you 8 guilders, and we will do it with a smile. Money, much like water, always finds a crack in the wall. No matter how many patrol ships the Dutch deployed, they could not plug every leak in an ocean of thousands of islands. A massive, parallel black market erupted. Local sultans, realizing the Dutch had impoverished them to build a colonial empire, eagerly broke their contracts. The iron grip of the VOC began to slip. And then, the global palette fundamentally shifted. This is the second great cause of the VOC's demise, and it is entirely about the changing tastes of the European consumer. For centuries, the absolute peak of luxury was the sharp, biting burn of black pepper, the rich warmth of clove, the dizzying scent of nutmeg. But as Europe entered the 18th century, a new obsession swept through the coffee houses and drawing rooms of London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Tea. Tea was no longer just an exotic curiosity, it was becoming a daily necessity. And who controlled the global tea trade? Not the Dutch. The Dutch had failed to crack the Chinese mainland. They had been expelled from Taiwan by highly organized Chinese pirates. The British, however, expertly pivoted. They poured their vast resources into India and China, monopolizing the tea trade and, later, the horrific but immensely profitable opium trade. The VOC was trapped holding a monopoly on a product that fewer and fewer people desperately needed, while their English rivals were addicting the world to caffeine and narcotics. And here we find the fatal structural flaw in the Dutch economic model. The VOC was, at its heart, a massive speculative parasite. They never transitioned into true production. Think about how modern megacorporations operate. A massive supermarket chain doesn't just buy milk and bread from farmers and resell it. They create their own in-house brands. They control the manufacturing, the packaging, and the distribution. They own the entire supply chain. The Dutch East India Company never did this. They bought spices for 2 pennies in Java and sold them for 1,000 pennies in Amsterdam. It was pure arbitrage. When the British began to outmaneuver them, the English didn't just buy spices. They physically uprooted the plants and transplanted them into their own colonial territories. When the Dutch were eventually forced to retreat from Ceylon, they spitefully hacked down every cinnamon tree they could find, hoping to destroy the market. The British simply sailed in, cleared the ground, and planted their own. The British built textile manufactories in India. They transitioned from merchants into industrialists. The Dutch remained stubbornly, fatally stuck as middlemen. The final nail in the coffin was driven by the deafening roar of naval artillery. The 17th and 18th centuries were punctuated by a series of brutal Anglo-Dutch wars. These were terrifying, apocalyptic clashes of wooden ships in the cold, gray waters of the North Sea. In the early wars, the Dutch held their own. They perfected the art of naval blockades, once sailing right into the mouth of the Thames and burning the English fleet at anchor. But war is a merciless teacher, and the British learned faster. They realized that burning merchant ships was a distraction. The true objective was to annihilate the enemy's military capacity to protect its trade lines. By the time the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War erupted in 1780, the balance of power had permanently shifted. The British Royal Navy had become an invincible maritime machine. They hunted down the Dutch fleets and smashed them to splinters. They captured heavily laden VOC merchantmen, draining the company's lifeblood. The Dutch lost an unfathomable amount of tonnage and capital in this conflict. Because the VOC functioned as the sovereign military of its own trade routes, when the company went to war, the company paid the bill. The financial drain was catastrophic. By the late 18th century, the greatest corporate entity in human history was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Their monopoly was broken by smugglers. Their core product had been eclipsed by tea. Their internal hierarchy was paralyzed by rampant corruption and embezzlement. And their grand, intimidating navy rested on the bottom of the ocean. The ledgers finally ran out of red ink. The company could no longer pay its debts, let alone its dividends. In 1799, the Dutch government quietly stepped in, nationalized the company's remaining debts and territorial assets, and formally dissolved the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie. After nearly 200 years of absolute, terrifying global dominance, the Leviathan was dead. So what do we do with the ghost of this trillion-dollar empire? We cannot deny that the VOC fundamentally wired the modern world. They were the architects of globalization. They proved that a corporation could bridge oceans, that capital could be pooled through public stock exchanges, and that a single brand could be recognized from the snowy canals of Amsterdam to the sweltering docks of Nagasaki. They opened diplomatic channels between the West and the East. They funded the cartographers who mapped the unknown edges of our planet. When you open a brokerage account today, or when you study the complex logistics of a modern supply chain, you are walking on roads paved by the Dutch East India Company. But history demands a full accounting. And the balance sheet of the VOC is soaked in an unimaginable amount of human blood. The immense wealth that poured into the Dutch Golden Age, the funds that built the stunning architecture, financed the beautiful paintings, and laid the foundation for the European Enlightenment, was directly extracted through the barrel of a musket. The company normalized the idea that human beings in Africa, in Indonesia, and in the Americas were merely disposable assets. They instituted corporate-backed massacres. They birthed a system of brutal, industrialized slavery simply to ensure the profit margins on nutmeg and cinnamon remained artificially high. It is a legacy that the modern world is still trying to digest. In 2022, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, stood before the global community and formally apologized for the role the Dutch state played in supporting the slave trade and the colonial violence of companies like the VOC. He accurately noted that no living person in the Netherlands today bears personal, individual blame for crimes committed centuries ago. But he acknowledged that the state carries the historical weight of that oppression. It was a profound, necessary moment of reckoning, a recognition that the systemic inequalities of our modern era have deep 17th century roots. The story of the Dutch East India Company is not just a dusty chapter about tall ships and exotic spices. It is a mirror held up to the very nature of human ambition. It shows us the breathtaking ingenuity of our species, our ability to navigate the stars, to invent complex financial instruments, to connect disparate cultures across impossible distances. But it also shows us our darkest capacity. It demonstrates what happens when the pursuit of endless, monopolistic growth is entirely divorced from human empathy. When a boardroom decides that the erasure of an entire island's population is an acceptable line item in an annual report. The VOC vanished into the history books in 1799, but the questions it forced upon the world about the limits of corporate power, the ethics of global trade, and the true cost of our everyday luxuries, those questions are still echoing in the boardrooms and marketplaces of today.